Hello, and thanks for joining us for the latest Technology Networks webinar. My name is George Hammond, Team Lead of Conference Production for Technology Networks, and I'm excited to be here to moderate the event today. I'm also incredibly pleased to introduce Vishal Mehta and Jeffrey Yablon, who are presenting their talk, Engineering Clinical Development for Novel Therapeutics, Cell and Gene Therapy, and Beyond. Vishal founded Ubuntu Research to accelerate the delivery of innovative therapies in a sustainable and modern way. With over 20 years of experience spanning pharma, biotech, and CRO sectors, he brings deep expertise in drug development strategy, clinical execution, and agile operations. While Jeffrey serves as the executive consultant for business development at Ubuntu Research, focusing on strategic partnerships and market adoption. With 30 years of experience in pharma, medtech, and clinical development, his leadership spans clinical ops, investor relations, and enterprise strategy. A very warm welcome to you both. Following the presentation, we will also have a Q&A session, and we welcome any questions that you may have. Please ask questions using the Q&A system to the right-hand side of the video player. If you experience any technical issues throughout the webinar, please click the chat icon in the bottom right corner to request support. And so, without further ado, I would now like to hand over to Vishal and Jeffrey to begin their talk.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning. George, can you hear us okay?
Loud and clear. You are live now, so please go ahead. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time this morning, this afternoon, wherever you're joining us from, to really join us in this conversation about evolving models and methodologies in terms of how we execute clinical research. We're wonderfully delighted to speak about some of the novel thinking that we have originated in terms of how clinical research needs to be conducted, especially in the era of innovative medicines such as cell and gene therapy. And I think this is going to be one of the key areas where we see a tremendous amount of innovation being supported by the right level of operational governance, oversight, and execution that supports the enrichment of these therapies. So one of the things that we decided to do differently this time was Jeff and I thought that we're all sort of enamored by slide presentations and webinar where we have sort of a monolithic conversation. So what we're going to try to do here is have a little bit of a dialogue, right, Jeff?
Indeed.
So Jeff is going to help me stay course, because infamously I've been told that I do run off track quite a bit, which is going to help me both in terms of making sure that we serve the objectives of what our conference outcomes are today, but also ensure that we plan the right thinking, right? Because a lot of things that we will speak about today will probably be the first time that this audience has heard about how clinical development and clinical operations needs to be adopted for today's innovative medicines. And we're going to be throwing terms like KRO and CDAS. So don't feel overwhelmed, first of all, but certainly, these are novel acronyms that are coming through really just to explain the evolution of where clinical research and clinical development needs to adopt into, so that we can achieve favorable outcomes for all of the wonderful medicines that you scientists are out there developing, and certainly helping make patient lives a little better.
Yeah, to expand on that, the bottom line up front is that lean and agile methodologies have been employed by many other industries. It's been less employed in the area of clinical development and more so in the area of cell and gene therapy development. What we're going to be putting forward is an opportunity to rethink the way things are done and can be done, that yields a more contemporaneous methodology that increases efficiency and reduces cost. But before we do that, we want to explain what Ubuntu is and what we are about. But reflecting on this first slide, companies must be agile. The cost of clinical development is an escalating spiral. An economist named Malthus, you may be familiar with, said years ago that if world population exceeds world food supply, we'll starve. The same thing can be said for the dollars expended in clinical research and novel asset development. that at some point the inflationary spiral is going to cause us to run out of money. The idea is to do more with less, to be nimble, agile, and contemporaneous in your approach. Vishal?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that ties in quite nicely with what the learning objectives that we defined for this webinar are. While we can talk about a lot of things, I think what we want to do is at the end of the day, give you enough of a understanding of what some of the novel, agile, and contemporaneous models need to look like as we evolve into, groundbreaking therapeutics with regards to the ability of curing diseases that we hadn't previously really thought about driving cures towards, at least in the short term. And then, showing you a little bit of a demonstration of a case study where we believe that you'll be able to understand this a little bit more from a practical perspective as well. But like I said, don't feel overwhelmed. I think, this conversation is ripe for a follow-on in many ways. So please take this as sort of the first pass at really understanding, what has been sort of designed along this new platform. And certainly within the 30, 40 minutes that we have together, we'll try to be as pointed and as succinct as possible, but try to give you enough of that overview so that there's appropriate takeaways.
I guess the first question the audience might be asking is, what's an Ubuntu? And I think your vision for Ubuntu, unpacking that and talking about why it was constructed and what it hopes to do is important to this discussion.
I would love to get into the Ubuntu discussion, Jeff, but I do want to take a quick moment and thank everyone who has helped us sort of get ready for this webinar presentation. So thank you to our partners at Technology Network. Thank you to our comms and PR team at Read Healthy to really help shape this conversation and make sure that what we're putting forward is now visible and audible to the external world. So with that, let me start by what Ubuntu is all about. So I suspect many of you have not heard the term Ubuntu, but it's something that as I was thinking about the next evolution of my life and the chapter, I started reading about it, a term that I had come across maybe 10 years or so ago in a corporate skills development presentation or a seminar that I was attending at that point in time. And it really resonated with me in terms of, what I thought was the future of healthcare and how healthcare needs to be both devised and then, consumed in terms of, its overall impact on patients. So Ubuntu very simply means shared humanity. And I think this has a significant relevance in where we stand today as a society, where we need to really think about what are those shared values that we bring together. Where is that interconnectedness, Jeff, where instead of having fragmented structures, politically divided structures, geographically disseminated structures, how do we create more of interconnectedness? Because when we develop medicines in lab, we don't necessarily say that this is for this geography or this political mindset or maybe this population to some extent, but I don't think we necessarily have that level of insights. But this is where Ubuntu brings it all together. And then it layers it with an additional element, which again, I was awestruck by as I started to read more about this philosophy, which is really about how do you bring compassion? Because healthcare is all about compassion, the caregivers, the people who take care of these patients and really help them through that journey. It's not just about the medical and the therapeutic intervention. It's really about sort of caring for these patients at the right level and the right lens so that they start to feel better about what they're experiencing. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that. But the question arises, I'm sure the audience is thinking about it pragmatically. How does that translate into a new model for clinical development that potentially is as good, if not better?
Absolutely. And I think in some ways you alluded to this, Jeff, as well. I think that the new model is really about agile contemporaneous development. So as you can see on this slide, Ubuntu was sort of, chartered by a group of like-minded individuals, people with very deep industry experience, having done drug development, having strategic drug development through developing programs, really developing TPPs, CDPs, and execution plans, and then coming back a little bit and sort of brainstorming with me and others to ask that very central question, which is, why does it take so much time and why is it so darn expensive to bring drugs to patients? And I think that's the central dogma that many of us operate around is, what is the kind of solution that's necessary today so that we can tackle both the time element of development, how long does it take? Because historically it's always been 10, 12, maybe even 15 years for certain drugs. And the cost spiral is just out of control, right? I think some of the recent publications that are out there talk about a cost of new product development at about $2.5 billion in fully capitalized costs. So that's clearly not sustainable with the innovation life cycle, especially as we look at CGTs as an example, where you have innovation that's happening at rapid pace. And if you're sort of stuck in this innovation dogma with a $2.5 billion investment, it's hard to pivot onto the new sciences.
Well, if you say it's too expensive at $2.5 million, at what price point does it make sense? At what price point is it effective operationally and allow the funders and founders of these assets to get the necessary ROI to support the investment in research?
Absolutely. No, I mean, I think, like any new technology, if we take examples from other industry, the cost of technology needs to decrease over time. And I think this is classically described by Moore's law. But in some ways, I think what we're seeing in our industry is that we're not seeing that reduction in costs. We're not seeing that as technology advances, we're not really able to optimize the cost of new development, the cost of what it takes, because in some ways, I think we are myopic, right? We always look at a new product or a new science as if we're starting from scratch. Whereas Ubuntu's thinking is really, you build upon the knowledgeware that already exists and use that knowledgeware to be able to make the kind of difference that you want to make in the world, because all of us have a limited footprint in terms of how long are we going to exist on this planet, and we have to find ways to make that existence more compatible as a society.
So these new informatics streams, inclusive of AI, seem to add additional layers of cost onto the overall mix. How do you manage one against the other to ensure that you're doing clinical development at the lowest total delivered costs that makes sense for the funders, founders, and fundamentally the patients?
Absolutely. So I think I'll give a one-line answer, and then maybe we'll go back and pivot to the presentation, is we need to find ways to reduce the cost and accelerate the time. And I think that's what the audience will see as part of the next 20, 30 minutes of conversation. It's really the time value of money and the acceleration in terms of how we can optimize research spend and budgets to be able to achieve similar, if not better outcomes in terms of what we're looking for.
And we hope to show you a model a couple slides down the road that exemplifies how we see those costs being plateaued, if not decreased, to provide better outcomes, better product, better path to fundamentally marketing patients.
Wonderful. So I hope from the last slide, there was enough acknowledgement from the group that, this is a group of very seasoned individuals, at least that are shown on the screen, many more in the background, that have come together and really start to ask that central question, which is, what does it take for us to bring medicines to patients faster, better, in a more reliable manner? So this is where we sort of paused and asked ourselves is, we're not looking for the solution just yet. Let us go back and look at what some of the root causes are of what are the limitations that exist in the current ways of working, in the current models, in the current processes that enable the translation of science into medicine. So essentially your development journey from the time you file your IND to the time you run your clinical trials, phase 1 to phase 3, submit it to the regulators for approval, and then think about life cycle management across additional indications, additional populations. We started to look at that and sort of started to rank some of the issues or problems that we saw were pretty eminent across different types of therapeutic modalities, different types of settings, whether the development was happening in biotech or large pharma, and then started to normalize that data to say, what are some of those core areas that we would want to affect to see different and better results? And as you can see, the top of the pyramid is sort of a representation of that where we started to understand that knowledge is the driver of science, and being able to really morph our services and our research processes around that knowledge barrier required us to frame everything through the context of what information, what analytics, what type of data supports the decision that executives make as they look to develop a new asset.
You mentioned the issue of data. We are inundated with data. I believe in the KRO model, we are capable of translating that data into actionable information that can be used for decision support, regulatory review, and analysis. So in looking at the architecture of this, I think we can unpack that a little more with that as a bulwark.
We will, right? I mean, I think we sort of sit on the precipice of amount of data and enabling technologies such as machine learning and artificial intelligence being the generators of the right information and insights. So as you look at the KRO model, so the first principles thinking that we arrived at was that we wanted to make sure that we had a group of experts or knowledge personnel that could really unpack the strategic elements of clinical development. And that becomes the core pillar of having the right talent, having the right people with that problem-solving mindset to be able to deliver value in terms of how we enrich a clinical trial, how we enrich a patient population, and how we think about the execution parameters. The next thing that sort of came along in our analysis was really, how do we govern around early stage enterprise, right? So if you look at early stage biotechs today, there's this sort of risk outcome based methodology that needs to be continuously adopted because of the live environment that these companies operate in, with both the emergence of their own data, but importantly, the emergence of competitive intelligence and what's happening in the outside world, and being able to blend that into the enterprise risk management principles, right? So that was the other thing that we wanted to make sure that we tackle as we develop the right solutions. The third one down the line was something that I started to speak about a little earlier, is how do we create value in the organization? And this value is not just incremental value. I think we can all say that through our lives, we've seen many solutions that have come through that provide that sort of small step change in terms of how clinical research is done, right? Whether you think about databases build being a few weeks faster, patient recruitment being a couple of months in advance, that still doesn't change the whole paradigm of 8 to 10 years. And the question that we were asking ourselves continuously through this process was, how do we change years out of the clinical development equation and not just days and weeks? And I think that's an important aspect that hopefully will come through as we get through more of the solution discussion. But it's an important element of what the solution was designed around, which is really to achieve the transformational changes which are aligned with the transformational medicines that we're operating under. And then the last thing, which again, I think is super important to us from a cultural perspective, is how do we bring the right intellectual humility into the conversation? I think our teams will be the first ones in a boardroom to say, we don't have all the answers. And I think, Jeff, you kind of say this quite elegantly, so I'll maybe pass it on to you at this point.
Well, I guess it comes down to not having the answers, but knowing the right questions to ask. So our clinical development as a service model known as CDES brings it from 10,000 feet where we've been discussing it thus far into an actionable, agile, rapidly scalable architecture that enables our sponsors, our clients to bring that in on an on-demand basis, on a subscription model, which is in direct opposition to the historical model of direct fee-for-service, a very transactional model. Service providers in clinical research heretofore have been very comfortable operating, saying, we will do whatever you want, but everything you want comes at a price. And that constant escalation and the disclarity when there are change orders and other disclarities entering into the mix results in additional cost, and it results in delays. And delays mean money. Time is money in this situation. So bringing it down closer to earth, our architecture suggests that we financially fit for purpose the construct of our clinical development programs for our sponsors. We provide them on a subscribed basis, so the services provided are all in relative to cost. And what we have is, because we're using actionable insights, we're translating that data into information, we become rapidly scalable and agile, able to pivot based upon the information readouts we get from the asset and also the exigencies of the marketplace at that time.
Beautifully said, beautifully said. So just to recap, right? I mean, we started with the first principles thinking. We really looked at what are some of the core elements of first principles or core issues that we want to be able to solve for that create transformative value for the medicines and the assets that are being developed. Then we looked at what is the right solution architecture, and CDAS sort of came about, which is clinical development as a service. And like Jeff said, I think from a societal perspective, we've started to consume many of the services through that subscription model. So the question we asked was, why not clinical research and clinical development? And that's where we were able to design our architecture so that we are able to maximize the agility, maximize the nimbleness that early stage biotech demands for as they think about what is the operating environment that brings them success.
So that becomes more of a point solution, do you think?
That's right. That's right. So it leads into, I guess, the bottom of our pyramid, which is the solution. So the solution itself, we branded this as Dimension T, right? Because we talk about time as being one of the most critical elements that we would want to influence. So as we think about time as a dimension, we've taken those principles and adapted them into sort of 4 different products that reflect the stage of development. So we have a product that's designed for academic and very early stage biotech, all the way to a product that's tuned into late stage development and likely in a large biotech or maybe in a biopharma setting, where we're able to augment and really sort of ensure that the application of the principles remains consistent, but now it's tailored to the stage of the organization.
It's interesting because we talk about fractional clinical expertise and we talk about the core attributes of regulatory compliance and digital platforming. How does that translate functionally into an operating model from day one with a newly engaged client?
I'm glad you asked that, Jeff, because I think I glossed over this. So really, I think from day one, what these products offer is a highly experienced and embedded team within our client infrastructure, right? So you have people who know what they need to do from day zero and can start creating results from day one onwards. They are powered with the right processes, because remember, we don't need to reinvent the process every time we go into a new legal entity, into a new organization. I think there's enough of a framework that we can use to build upon those early stage wins that we want to achieve and really start to create a higher order value for these organizations. This time is critical, right? If you ask any biotech CEO today, they would trade off time for any other element of their business, because that is the Achilles heel of what's going to define success for their organization.
So I hear what you're saying, but does this then mean that the sponsor team does not need to hire and create infrastructure or build systems and processes? What does Ubuntu do for, with, and substituting for what the sponsor team would do in normal practice?
Absolutely. So I think under the solution architecture, as you rightly said, Ubuntu provides a set of clinical experts that range from medical to regulatory to operations and beyond, along with a very defined framework of how we see the execution of these assets, right? And that's why we've sort of broken it down into these 4 different categories that allow us to enrich from early phase 1 all the way through phase 3, phase 4, because certainly the setting dictates the depth and breadth of resources, but also the depth and breadth of the nature of the processes from a quality management perspective, as well as, what we haven't talked about much is the digital infrastructure, right? Because sometimes for early stage biotechs to set up that digital footprint within their IT infrastructure is a significant investment. And as we will see in one of the subsequent slides, I think with the high failure rates that we experience, those investments, are generally not providing the right ROI for these companies.
So what we see most often is almost an arm's length relationship between the sponsor and the vendors supporting the initiative, CROs, allied service providers, etc. To me, in this model, it breaks down that barrier where the KRO becomes an integral component, extension of the sponsor team. And I think that's what we've envisioned, and that is what our goal is. We don't want to do everything for them. We are not the sponsor. We recognize our role, but that arm's length relationship barrier is reduced and we become more of a partner and a key contributor to the success of the asset, correct?
Absolutely. Well said. And I think if we can go on to the next slide, I think it embellishes a little bit further on this thinking where, we've tried to depict, what worked well, 30, 40, 50 years ago were the sort of the kind of bridges that were two-way bridges, right? These are sort of bi-directional, provide the right infrastructure for, for the nature of the vehicle, the speed to destination that was desired, or some of the other elements that were prevalent at this point. But really now we sit at a very pivot point in terms of where medical research is going, and I think we need to think about the infrastructure in the form of these bridges that are really multinodal, right? They sort of take inputs, outputs from different parts and really create more options and opportunities for the transportation of these assets, right? Which is sort of taking the asset from early stage to mid stage to late stage development, but with the right notes, bearing in from whether you want to call it, your biomarker and your translational data, your real world evidence data, natural history data. I mean, I think there's so much more that goes into a development program today than what we've seen in the past. And I think that's what the design of these types of infrastructure to enable innovative medicines like cell and gene therapy is crucial, and again, became the foundational pieces of what Ubuntu's CDAS solution needs to look like.
I guess the pragmatist in me wants to really get to the bottom line in terms of what Ubuntu functionally is and does, and how does this show itself in terms of output, in terms of cost savings. I know we'll get there, but I just want to point out the fact that we are bringing this more closely down to earth as we continue this discussion. And this pictorial really just exemplifies what used to be relatively straightforward and simple in the past. I remember my first clinical trial was done in pen and paper without any type of EDC, CROs, or anything else. It was all done in-house. 14 months after delivery to the FDA, we got an approval. Now, if you look at the future, where it is now, the on and off ramps and the multitude of services and layers of support in informatics provide clarity and disclarity at the same time. So one of the goals in terms of our design is to create clarity out of chaos, to create what inherently will be a single line transport in a multimodal environment. And we have to meet the needs of both the financiers of these assets and also the developers and operators of the asset company. And I think in the next slide, we're going to be showing how we do so.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No, I think if there's anything that folks take away from today's presentation is probably that bridge analogy, right? Because I think we stand at the pivot of transformative medicine. We stand at the pivot of delivering efficient healthcare. And if we can challenge ourselves to be able to create these novel infrastructures that are both efficient and optimal and right-sized for where innovation is happening today, which is biotechs. It's not your large pharmas anymore that are developing new innovations. They're certainly buying this at the right point in their clinical development program or as they get closer to commercial. But it's really that smaller, nimble, niche biotech that still needs a lot of these things, but can't afford to make all of that investment upfront. That's a change that we're advocating for. So as Jeff nicely alluded to and walked us into this, right, is we asked the question in terms of what keeps our stakeholders up at night. And, there's sort of three groups of stakeholders that we look at, two of them being represented on this slide. One is, the people who are financing the medical innovation and research. And the other one is, the operators or the executives of the company. And if you see, the mission for both of these groups of stakeholders is the same. They want to bring novel, innovative medicines to patients in the most reliable, expedient, and cost-effective manner possible. But how they measure success may be a little different, right? For investors, it's really about that predictability, right? Is there enough known risks that they can manage, or are there unpredictable events that are going to emerge, which is going to cost them dearly as they look to deploy their dry powder, for example, right? Where is the capital efficiency, right? Have we talked about that enough to say we can't continue to spend the way that we've been spending to develop these innovative medicines because the other costs are high. Manufacturing costs of an autologous CAR T product is multifold higher than developing a pill or a capsule. ROI and translating strategy, I think, are pretty obvious ones that most everyone would be familiar with. And
I'll tell you, on the biotech executive side, I'm living that firsthand. In addition to my role in supporting Ubuntu, I serve as Chief Operating Officer for a clinical stage biotech. Daily discussion about how we accelerate the development of the program. How do we realize those key inflection points, and what are the potential barriers that we need to overcome to get there? I am concerned every moment of every day about the escalating costs. How can we cap the costs? How can we get to the next inflection point before we run out of money? And how can I raise the next tranche of money to enable us to move to the next stage gate? Clinical risks, we try to account for them to the degree possible, but data must drive our decision. The outcomes, the patient records from those clinical trials, the CRFs that we're processing, the adverse event reports. We try to control what we can, but sometimes you get thrown a curveball. Both sides of the equation really require you have to be strong. You have to be facile. You have to constantly have your head on a swivel and be looking at both the issues and opportunities as you're going through it. But there are some steps you can employ that can mitigate some, not all of these concerns, and at the end of the day, increase efficiency and reduce cost. So in this next slide, we talk about the billion-dollar experiment. So in this particular situation, we know that for every 100 assets that go into phase 1, there's only going to be 7 or 8 that eventually make it through as an approvable entity. And that also does account for the various off-ramps in terms of inflection points and sales and things like that. But the bottom line here is an 8 to 10 year endeavor and over $1 billion spend to get to full commercializations. And you have the operational risk and scientific risk, which must be married and balanced together. And in many ways, it's a headless hydra that must be fought on a daily basis. The model doesn't set everyone up for success. And those of faint heart should not be in this business because there is more risk than reward. And we need to be cognizant of that. And we look at the probability of success being low, there's a lot to consider. So in the Ubuntu model, how do you make people sleep better at night?
Absolutely. So, we didn't want to show this slide up front because I think this is somewhat, at least it was depressing for me when we started to put this together, because we looked at data for the last, I think, 2 decades or so as we were doing this analysis. And it was very, very starkly observing that, the trends have not changed. The only trend that changed was the cost, which kind of kept going up, every 5-year cut of the data that we looked at. And the $1 billion that we sort of quote here is different than the $2.5 billion that I said earlier, which is the fully capitalized cost, which means, it accounts for all of the failures, all of the other, overhead costs, operating costs, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there's, literature to sort of support, that the $1 billion are roughly the cost of development from IND to BLA. And this is where we believe that through the Ubuntu ways of working, through the KRO principles, through the CDAS model, and eventually the experience of the Dimension T product, that our clients can experience, I'll boldly say about a 20 to 25% cost savings. And that those cost savings are largely derived from what we call as the time value savings, which means that if we can inflect that curve of development by 18, 24, 30 months, that's where you start to see a significant upside in terms of the commercial potential of these assets.
So the idea is if you're spending $1 billion and you look at a 20% ENPV, that means I get $200 million in real value back into my organization that I can use for other assets or other indications for the current asset. It gives me much greater flexibility and I can sleep better at night.
That's right. And that combined with, let's not forget the risk. Right? I think we're still operating within 10% probability of success. Maybe for CGTs, there is a slightly higher order success rate, but in general, when you look at oncology as a field, and I think that's what this data is based on, we're at very low teen numbers. And creating better predictability, reducing some of the operational risk, which I don't think it's talked about enough in our industry, is the elements that Dimension T brings into the mix.
So in this next slide, it really kind of shows Ubuntu in action for a CAR T asset. And leave it to you, Vishal, unpack that, please.
Yeah, so I think there was a heightened interest on our side to be able to speak to a case study, right? Because everything that we've said up until now may be very much ethereal to many people that don't operate in this environment on a day-to-day basis, but still want to see the impact of a positive development program, the impact of a novel way of working in terms of how value can be realized. So I think in this slide, what we talk about is a case study where we have a situation with a autologous CAR T company that is developing in very early stages of development phase. They're planning for their phase 1. And we started a conversation with them to say, what's the most optimal path that this company can take, not knowing, beyond phase 1 if they had the appropriate financing to continue development or what the next stages of the morphism of this company would look like. So when we applied the Dimension T solution across this set of assumptions, what we saw is the curve on the right? So what it shows is on the red line, you can actually deliver the asset 7.5 months earlier in this example, right? So instead of what the company was planning for, which was about a 30-month runway to get to a phase 1 readout from IND, we were able to work with them and model how we can get to a 22.5 months. And much of that, as you can see, was pretty early on. The separation of the curves started to happen not late in the development stage, not at month 20, but really at months 7 and 8, we could start to see that by applying the Dimension T model with the set of resources that comes in, with the maturity of the processes, with the digital footprint, right? How people need to do their work that is digitally enabled so that they are not taking 2x the time to get through activities is what starts to show up on this curve very quickly. And this is what we were really proud of when we saw this, is that now we had a live example where we could do a comparison of what the company was going to do if the Dimension T model did not exist, which is sort of that traditional pathway, maybe working with the CROs, which is the blue line in between, but still not being able to get that level of acceleration.
But we know time is money, and you can apply a figure to that. But in a real world, how much money was actually saved? How much actually went back to the balance sheet in terms of real dollars, approximately?
Absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up, Jeff, because I didn't realize that we did not have this number on the slide. So the financial engineering for this particular analysis, I believe, yielded a net value recognition of about $15 million to get to a phase 1 readout.
In a 7-month period.
And a 7 month.
So if you extend it across a 10-year life cycle, able to save $15 million every 6-7 months, times 10 years, we're talking about a large dollar amount, aren't we?
It is absolutely. And I think this is where, we start to get the validation of not the full 200 million of ENPV that we talk about, but really those early wins, which again, as I mentioned earlier, for a biotech CEO, that's what's important. For an investor, that's what's important, because they are thinking about what their ROIs are, what their next stage of investment looks like, and potentially what the exit strategy might be for some of these assets.
Now, one other question I may have, in this particular situation, did this offset the need to hire people internally? Did the Ubuntu team go in and support the organizations in specific roles?
So this model was specifically around that. So as you can see, I think there is the 4th row on the table. The functional area experts that Ubuntu was able to provision for this was medical, clinical sciences, clinical operations, safety and pharmacovigilance, regulatory and project leadership or program management. So all of those subject matter expertise that enable clinical drug development were built into this model. So again, had we not applied this model, the company would have hired these resources, whether they hired them full-time, fractional, FSP. I think there's many ways that people can get access to resources, but what the Dimension T does is it aggregates, and it really creates a strong linkage in terms of the work deliverables that is associated, because everyone needs to work together. Right?
So the last point I'd like you to make is with regard to the construct of this. Was it a single subscribed cost per month that enabled the organization to avail themselves of people, process, and technologies to solve the problem?
100%, right? I mean, I think that the whole concept of subscription model is built into the framework that we talked about earlier. Is you pay for what you use.
So the bottom line is the bottom line.
The bottom line is the bottom line, and that's the agility. Again, I sort of harp on the word agility, because small biotechs may plan for a lot of things, but they need to adjust their business model as new data emerges, as the competitive landscape becomes more visible, and as the commercial landscape starts to be put on some of these development programs.
So as we get to the end of our presentation, this is kind of the roadmap that Ubuntu has constructed from concept to exit.
I mean, we've really taken what's published in literature with regards to what this is called on the top of the slide is the value of death curve. So the value of death is really, how much you have time on the x-axis, cash flow on the y-axis, and what you're showing is, that you are really depleting a lot of cash before you can start to have an asset valuation that starts to become positive. And the Ubuntu model not only reduces the trough of the cash needs, but also cuts the value inflection point at an earlier point in time. And those are the two things that really govern what we believe is the evolution of clinical research and clinical development. I think we're being very bold here in terms of positioning this as a new model, because we believe that this change is necessary, and we believe that we have the right solution architecture governing that change that enables us to get into that subscription-based clinical services consumption, creating time value inflections, really governing our programs around time and not just delivery, and creating those unprecedented ENPV outcomes that you talked about, Jeff, right? Because we have to crack the big problem. We are not here to crack the small problems, the miniatures that only give us a step change ahead in terms of where we want to get as a society in terms of developing these new drugs.
So the bottom line is we're able to do cell and gene therapy, asset development, more cost efficiently, lower pricing associated with the overall spend, and arguably better outcomes. What do you say?
I would absolutely agree with all those statements, and I'm just being cautious of the time. I think this is our conclusion slide, something that's very near and dear to my heart, which is be the change that you wish to see in the world. And this was a quote by Mahatma Gandhi. And the reason this is important is I think a lot of us in the industry talk about the need for a change, but someone needs to own that change. And I'm very proud of the team at Ubuntu who has taken that ownership and putting a path forward to what this new world of clinical research, clinical development, clinical operation needs to look like, with a very thoughtful architecture and a very precise solution that can be easily, quickly, formatively adopted in small biotechs.
Well, I guess now is the opportunity to open it up to questions, comments, and concerns. So you folks who have been listening to us, give us your best shot.
That's wonderful. Thank you so very much, Vishal and Jeffrey. I'm sure that everyone here will agree that that was a fantastic and incredibly insightful talk, and we really do appreciate you sharing your expertise with us today. As you mentioned, I'm now going to move straight into the Q&A session. Just a quick reminder to our audience, to submit a question to our speakers, you should enter your question into the box on the right-hand side of your screen and click send. And we will answer as many questions as possible during the time that we have available. I can see that we have already received some questions, so I'll move straight onto these now. So Vishal and Jeffrey, your first question is, how can the CDAAS solution be effective in scaling across multiple assets in various stages of development?
You want to start, Jeff?
Yeah, that's the beauty of it. It is scalable by using fractional resources, pre-deployed workflows and SOPs, and a informatics overlay. You're able to do more with less. The traditional way of doing things is when you encounter a problem, you throw more bodies and money at it. we're endeavoring to obviate the need for that, to have the systems and the data to drive decision making, to maintain a lean and very functional contemporaneous organization that truly seeks to solve problems. If disclarity occurs in this particular model, it doesn't result in price increases or change orders. People might find that to be somewhat worthy of suspicion, but trust us, we've done it, we prove it can be done, and it works. We're all veterans of this industry of clinical development. Arguably, most of our people have 20 to 30 years experiences. And we've seen the growth and the evolution as it relates to clinical development, the escalating cost spiral. We have a model that can do it faster, better, and cheaper.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for your insights, Jeffrey. And moving on to your next question today, how is this model differentiated from what CROs are currently offering to their biopharma?
Great question.
Yeah, we didn't touch the terminology here, but we refer to sort of our way of working as a KRO-CRO symbiosis. And you know, that the emphasis is on the term symbiosis because we do believe that the CROs, as they're currently designed, they play an important role in terms of delivering the clinical trials, right? So we think about the clinical development journey from strategy, design, planning, and execution. And I think it's really the planning and execution pieces that we ourselves partner with CROs on and make sure that, you know, we leverage the capabilities that they've built over the past 2.5 decades, and really the advanced knowledge that they have in terms of delivering these clinical programs. But, you know, the KRO is more sort of embedded in the sponsor environment, as we sort of alluded earlier. This is more about thinking and building the right strategy, knowing where to sort of pivot in terms of responding to data and making business-oriented decisions, and really looking for that strategic initiatives that are going to deliver the best value as we partner with CROs and other vendors in the field.
I guess 2 points I want to make is, one, if we do our job effectively at Ubuntu, we set the CROs up for success. By the time it gets to the clinical stage asset and entering the 1B, the 2B clinical trial phases, there should be no disclarity. There should be no change orders. We've accounted and unpacked all of the preclinical data. We've set the organization up with the right workflows. We set things up to a degree that there's no good reason to add additional sites, additional subjects, if we've already accounted for that at the beginning. This way, when the handoff occurs to the CRO, they have laser focus and precision in terms of what they want to do, and that give and take that normally occurs happens to a less degree. Second thing I might mention is we are not in the business of doing site management, for example. So we will not be deploying CRAs and those other functional people. We will work and ensure the success of the asset, we'll ensure the success of the CRO, and we have worked very collaboratively with CROs as they come to understand that we are friend, not foe. Would you agree?
Absolutely. It's all about creating the win-win.
Wonderful. Thank you so much both for your insights there. Now, I am aware of the time, so I am going to quickly move on to the next question today, which is, in your experience, what are some of the most common pitfalls that CGT companies may face, perhaps during early clinical development, whether that be from a governance perspective or from another perspective entirely?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm ready to write a book on this. I've written several chapters around, you know, what could be the pitfalls. But if I was to highlight a couple of them, I think it's really thinking about holistically all of the needs of a CGT clinical trial. And that starts with the patients, right? Thinking about how the patients are finding themselves to be enrolled in these clinical trials, because remember, as it stands today, CGT trials are run at large academic centers, which means it's difficult for a large majority of the patients to either find their way into those systems or being able to take time off work or do other things that is necessary. So I think it's really understanding the patient flow and ensuring that, you know, the right patients are able to benefit from some of the early clinical work that's happening. On the sponsor side, it's really about understanding the cross-functional nature of this development. I think we've seen one too many times where there's an interplay between clinical readiness and product development and manufacturing readiness. And I think sometimes folks that haven't had as much experience in the field of CGT are sort of taken by surprise the amount of effort that goes into getting the product and the process ready to deliver a clinical product for patients that can then be dosed at these centers and certainly used in terms of treatment and data collection. So I would say, yeah, sort of to be brief, those would be the two real quick things that jump to my mind, Jeff.
I would agree with you.
Super. Thank you so much. And we have time for perhaps one or two more questions before we close out this session. We've had a nice follow-up question from that one, which is how can smaller biotech firms strike a balance between agility and regulatory rigor when transitioning from preclinical to early clinical stages?
It's a great question. And from my perspective, everything that goes wrong usually goes wrong at the beginning. So if you set yourself up at the beginning, when you look at your preclinical data and you're looking to transition into clinical and become a clinical stage company, that you take a very rigorous methodological approach in terms of decisions that you make, having the right SOPs, having the right workflows in place, ensuring your TPP is correct, and making sure that your CDP is well aligned to the needs of the asset and also the functional responsibilities you have in terms of getting into clinic and getting it to patients. The third element I might mention is making sure your informatics layers, whatever you're using, whether it's a CTMS, an EDC product, whatever it may be, they are aligned, you have full visibility, and it is meeting the needs of the organization in terms of using those actionable insights to then drive your decision making. With us, Vishal?
I was just going to say thank you to whoever asked that question because it leads me straight into a very commercial sort of input, which is we've created a 21 chapter playbook for these early stage biotechs, right? So as we engage with them, we introduce that playbook that covers everything from governance to execution to operations to regulatory methodologies. And this really ties in the overall strategy of how these companies need to be thinking about, because sometimes I think there's aspiration to do stuff, but there's not enough resources, whether that be the time resource or the money resource that's available. So I think we provide a good litmus test in terms of using our plans to be able to really achieve that organizational alignment in terms of what's actually doable versus not just what the CEO or the board wants to do.
If I may, that playbook I want to point out is not dogmatic. It's not to say that every company needs to follow that playbook chapter and verse. We use a principle of mass customization. Use the playbook as a foundation and then adapt it to meet the specific needs of your organization and your assets. But unless you have a framework, you wind up resulting in chaos. And we're trying to reduce this clarity, have better clarity and resolve in terms of how you're going to do it. So it's not a panacea, it's a tool, and used effectively, it can benefit their organization.
Beautiful.
Wonderful. Excellent responses from both of you there. And that brings us on quite nicely to our final question for the session. So, is the biotech market, including biotech founders and funders, ready for this novel solution that you've described and discussed throughout the session today?
Doing things the same way and expecting different results is,
We know
what happens, right? So I think if you sort of look at it from that perspective, what we believe is that we need new models, right? We have such tremendous opportunities from the medical innovation side, and our top of the funnel when it comes to having new products that need to test a hypothesis is significantly higher than our ability to translate them into successful drug candidates. And I think this is where this model makes a significant and meaningful impact to be able to pick out the right science and advance that forward, but also learn from the failures, right? We don't sort of just put the failures aside. We take a lot of those learnings and embed that into what we started talking about, which is that knowledge ware that we built around the KRO concept.
I might conclude by saying this. Being different is both an opportunity and a curse. We know very well nobody's going to get fired for calling the major CROs first and doing things in the old way. Opening someone's mind to a revisionist method and platform takes some courage. And people who have gone on this journey with us have directly benefited, and we'd be glad to provide references relative to our ability to do so. So I would just implore those who have listened today, take a chance, because we know about doing things the same way. Let's look at how your asset can be accelerated through some novel approaches, some different methodologies that have direct impact on cost, quality, and efficiency. So since it is our last question, from my perspective, thank you very much for taking the time to listen to us. We hope we have the opportunity to speak to some of you after this lecture today. Vishal?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks for your time.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us today, Vishal and Jeffrey. Unfortunately, that is all that we have time for, but it's been an absolute pleasure to have you present with us, and we really do appreciate you sharing your time and your expertise with all of us, as well as addressing all of those fantastic questions from our audience. A quick note for our audience, a certificate of attendance is available to download from the Handouts tab on the right-hand side of the webinar platform. And this webinar will now be made available on demand, so if you have any friends or colleagues that you think may be interested in this webinar, please feel free to share the link with them. So that just leaves me to say a massive thank you once again to our incredible speakers, Vishal and Jeffrey, and to everyone in the audience. We will see you again soon. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.